All right, let's move on to section 3 of the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding. Section 3 of the relation of the understanding to objects in general. Okay? And the possibility of knowing them a priori. Excuse me. That which in the preceding section we have discussed individually and separately, we shall now try to treat in a unified and connected way. Okay? We saw that there are three subjective sources of knowledge. Three subjective sources of knowledge, on which rests the possibility of an experience in general. Is this the threefold synthesis? And of knowledge and its objects, namely sense, imagination, and apperception. So like sense data, like the understanding, imagination / synthesis. Apperception is like the self-awareness of it. Maybe. Each of these may be considered as empirical, namely in its application to given appearances. Each of these may be considered as empirical in its application to given appearances. All of them, however, are also a priori, elements or grounds that themselves render this empirical use possible. Sense, represents appearances empirically in perception, imagination in association and reproduction, apperception in the empirical consciousness of the identity of these reproductive representations with the appearances with which they are given, and therefore in recognition. But all of perception rests a priori on pure intuition. If the perception is regarded as representation, then on time as the former of inner intuition. Association on the pure synthesis of imagination, and empirical consciousness on pure apperception. That is, on the thoroughgoing identity of oneself in all possible representations. If now we wish to follow up the inner ground of this connection of representations to the point at which they must all converge, in order that they may therein, first of all, acquire the unity of knowledge which is requisite for a possible experience, then we must begin with pure apperception. If now we wish to follow up the inner ground of this connection of representations to the point at which they must all converge, in order that they may therein, first of all, acquire the unity of knowledge which is requisite for a possible experience, then we must begin with pure apperception. Okay. Intuitions are nothing to us and do not concern us in the least if they cannot be taken up into consciousness. Right. Just vague sense data, into which they may enter either directly or indirectly. And only through consciousness is knowledge possible. Right. We are conscious a priori of the thoroughgoing identity of ourselves with regard to all representations that can ever belong to our knowledge. And are conscious... Okay, hold on. We are conscious a priori of the thoroughgoing identity of ourselves with regard to all representations that can ever belong to our knowledge. And are conscious of it as forming a necessary condition of the possibility of all representations. Because these can only represent something in me insofar as they belong with everything else to one consciousness, and therefore must at least be capable of being connected in it. Okay. This principle holds a priori, and may be called the transcendental principle of the unity. And I think the point he's making is like, okay, all of this stuff coming together, like the imagination, the intuitions, experience, etc. is like part of it is the recognition that it does come together in one consciousness, transcendental principle of the unity. This principle holds a priori and may be called the transcendental principle of the unity. And we kind of know beforehand, before we experience anything, that in order for us to have any knowledge, like first we have to have experience, then we have to have funnel it through the understanding, and then we have to have it unified somewhere in us, and then we're able to have the apperception. And all of this is contingent upon us being a unity, like one thing that holds all of the necessary things in order to experience and then learn things and then have judgments, knowledge, concepts, etc. Okay. This unity of the manifold in one subject is synthetic. Therefore, pure apperception supplies us with a principle of the synthetic unity of the manifold in all possible intuition. Footnote. This proposition is of great importance and should be carefully considered. All representations have a necessary reference to a possible empirical consciousness. For if they do not possess that reference, and if it were entirely impossible to become conscious of them, this would be the same as saying they do not exist at all. All empirical consciousness has a necessary reference to a transcendental consciousness which precedes all particular experience, namely, the consciousness of myself as original apperception. Okay, this makes sense to me. It is absolutely necessary, therefore, that in my knowledge all consciousness should belong to one consciousness, that of myself. Here we have a synthetic unity of the manifold, parentheses, of consciousness, close parentheses, which is known a priori, and which thus supplies a foundation for synthetic a priori propositions concerning pure thought, in the same way as space and time supply the foundation for synthetic a priori propositions concerning the form of mere intuition. The synthetic proposition that all the variety of empirical consciousness must be combined into one single self-consciousness is the absolutely first and synthetic principle of all our thought in general. It should be remembered that the mere representation I, in reference to all other representations, the collective unity which it makes possible, is the transcendental consciousness. It does not matter here whether this representation is clear, empirical consciousness, or obscure. And not even whether it is actual, but the possibility of the logical form of all knowledge rests necessarily on the relation of this apperception as a faculty. Yeah, okay. This synthetic unity, however, presupposes or includes a synthesis. And if this unity is to be a priori necessary, the synthesis must also be a priori. This synthetic unity presupposes or includes a synthesis. And if this unity is to be a priori necessary, right, which we agree it is, the synthesis must also be a priori. Because it's also necessary. We couldn't have, the unity or the knowledge. Yeah, okay. I think what he's saying is that's also necessary. The transcendental unity of apperception therefore refers to the pure synthesis of imagination as an a priori condition of the possibility of all composition of the manifold in one knowledge. Now only the productive synthesis of imagination can take place a priori, because the reproductive one rests on conditions of experience. That makes sense. Thus, the principle of the necessary unity of pure productive synthesis of imagination prior to apperception is the ground of the possibility of all knowledge, especially that of experience. Thus, the principle of the necessary unity of pure productive synthesis of imagination prior to apperception is the ground of the possibility of all knowledge, especially that of experience. The synthesis of the manifold in imagination is called transcendental if, without distinctions of intuitions, it affects only the a priori combination of the manifold. And the unity of this synthesis is called transcendental if, with reference to the original unity of apperception, it is represented as a priori necessary. As the possibility of all knowledge is founded on this unity of apperception, it follows that the transcendental unity of the synthesis of imagination is the pure form of all possible knowledge, and through it, therefore, all objects of possible experience must be represented a priori. Sorry, what? The synthesis of the manifold. I think I'm getting a little hung up because I forgot what productive synthesis is. I remember reproductive synthesis as the person knocking on the door and our consciousness. That's why it's based on experience. I don't know how this is going to work. Productive synthesis. Kant. According to Kant, the mind receives sensory data from the world around us and then is synthesized into meaningful perceptions through the faculty of the productive imagination. So it's just like the synthesis of information into the understanding, through the understanding. Okay, I'm going to reread the previous paragraph too, because I'm not sure I'm 100%. Well, I'm definitely not 100% there. I'll probably never be 100% there, but I'm not even close. This synthetic unity, however, presupposes or includes a synthesis, and if this unity is to be a priori necessary, the synthesis must also be a priori. Right, meaning if we think that the unity is necessary, then all the component parts of the unity must be necessary, and probably the most important part of that is the synthesis, getting it from experience to the understanding. Okay, the transcendental unity of apperception therefore refers to the pure synthesis of imagination, right? As an a priori condition of the possibility of all composition of the manifold in one knowledge. Yes, meaning our self-recognition of this process recognizes that the synthesis. Okay. Now, only the productive synthesis of imagination can take place a priori, because the reproductive one, knocking on the door example, rests on conditions of experience. Okay? Thus, the principle of the necessary unity of pure productive synthesis of imagination prior to apperception is the ground of the possibility of all knowledge. It effectively kind of precedes, or it is even a part of that reproductive knowledge too, and separate from it. Okay, the synthesis of the manifold in imagination is called transcendental. The synthesis of the manifold in imagination is called transcendental, okay, if, without distinction of intuitions, it affects only the a priori combination of the manifold. And the unity of this synthesis is called transcendental if, With reference to the original unity of apperception, it is represented as a priori necessary. As the possibility of all knowledge is founded on this unity of apperception, right? It follows that the transcendental unity, and that would be because, like, all knowledge is based on experience. All experience is funneled through our experience and then synthesized and then results in our understanding. So therefore, all knowledge and all experience is, like, necessarily involves this process. As the possibility of knowledge is founded on this unity of apperception, it follows that the transcendental unity of the synthesis of imagination is the pure form of all possible knowledge. Right? Okay. And through it, therefore, all objects of possible experience must be represented a priori. Like, just like I kind of said, like that kind of codependent relationship of experience and knowledge. The unity of apperception with reference to the synthesis of imagination is the understanding. And the same unity with reference to the transcendental synthesis of imagination, the pure understanding. Let's reread that. The unity of apperception with reference to the synthesis of imagination is the understanding. The unity of apperception with reference to the synthesis of the imagination is the Okay, yes. And the same unity with reference to the transcendental synthesis of imagination is the pure understanding. Okay. Just made it transcendental and therefore it becomes pure. Because we're not, yeah. Hence, in the understanding, there exist pure a priori forms of knowledge which contain the necessary unity of the pure synthesis of imagination in regard to all possible appearances. Okay? These are the categories. Right. Hence, in the understanding, there exist pure a priori forms of knowledge which contain the necessary unity of pure synthesis of imagination in regard to all possible experience. These are the categories, that is, the pure concepts of the understanding. The empirical faculty of knowledge of human beings therefore contains necessarily an understanding which refers to all objects of the senses, although only by means of intuition and of its synthesis through imagination. And all appearances as data for possible experience are subject to this understanding, right? Just, you kind of talked about that a minute ago. As this reference of appearances to possible experience is likewise necessary, because without it we should receive no knowledge through them, and they would not in the least concern us. It follows that the pure understanding, by means of the categories, is a formal and synthetic principle of all experience, and that appearances have thus a necessary reference to the understanding. I gotta read that again. It follows that the pure understanding, by means of the categories, is a formal and synthetic principle of all experience, and that appearances have thus a necessary reference to the understanding. Yeah, that makes sense to me. As this reference of appearances to possible experience is likewise necessary, because without it we should receive no knowledge of them. Right. We shall now try to clarify the necessary connection in which the understanding stands with the appearances by means of the categories, and begin at the beginning, namely with the empirical. What is given to us first is appearance. When combined with consciousness, appearance is called perception. The relation to an at least possible consciousness. Appearance could never become for us an object of knowledge. Without the relation to an at least possible consciousness, appearance would never become for us an object of knowledge. It would therefore be nothing to us, and since it has no objective reality in itself but exists only in being known, it would be nothing at all. As every appearance contains a manifold, whereby different perceptions are encountered in the mind, individually and dispersed, they need to be combined in a way that they cannot be in sense itself. Hence there exists in us an active faculty of the synthesis of this manifold. This faculty we call imagination, and the action that it immediately performs on perceptions I call apprehension. Footnote. It has hardly struck any psychologist that imagination is a necessary ingredient of perception itself. This is due partly to their limiting this faculty to reproduction, partly to the belief that the senses do not only give us impressions but also combine them and thus produce images of objects. This, however, requires something more than our receptivity of impressions, namely a function for their synthesis. I agree. Since imagination is meant to bring the manifold of intuition into an image. You say imagination? Since imagination is meant to bring the manifold of intuition into an image, it must first admit the impressions into an activity. That is, apprehend them. It is clear, however, that even this apprehension of the manifold could not by itself produce a coherence of impressions or an image, were it not that there is a subjective ground for calling one perception from which the mind has passed to another back to those which follow. And this is like the string idea, right? So like while I'm perceiving things and being presented with sense data, like I'm referring back to all of my past experiences and categorizing, formalizing, contextualizing, etc. And experience doesn't allow me to do that. It's something else. The understanding, or like imagination. And thus for presenting a whole series of perceptions. This is the reproductive faculty of imagination, which on this account is merely empirical. If representations, as they happen to meet with one another, reproduced one another without distinction, there would arise no determinate coherence of representations, but merely an irregular accumulation of them, and never any knowledge. Their reproduction must, therefore, be subject to a rule whereby one representation connects to in the imagination with another representation, and not with a third. It is this subjective and empirical ground of reproduction, according to rules, which is called the association of representations. If this unity of association did not also possess an objective ground, which makes it impossible that appearances should be apprehended by the imagination in any other way, then under the condition of a possible synthetic unity of this apprehension, then the fact that appearances form a coherence of human knowledge would be a matter of complete contingency. If this unity of association did not also possess an objective ground, which makes it impossible, double negative, that appearances should be apprehended by the imagination in any other way than under the condition of a possible synthetic unity of this apprehension, then the fact that appearances form a coherence of human knowledge would be a matter of complete contingency. Okay, so this unity of association needs some objective ground. Even though we had the power of associating perceptions, it would still be a matter of uncertainty and contingency whether they would themselves be associable. And, In case they should not be associable, there might exist a number of perceptions, nay, presumably a whole sensibility, in which a great deal of empirical consciousness would be found in my mind, but found in separation and without belonging to one consciousness of myself. This, however, is impossible, only by ascribing all perceptions to one consciousness of original apperception. Can I say of all perceptions that I am conscious of them? There must therefore be an objective ground, that is, one that can be understood a priori antecedently to all empirical laws of the imagination, on which rests the possibility, nay, even the necessity, of a law that pervades all appearances, a law that makes us look upon all appearances without exception as data of the senses, associable in themselves, and subject to universal rules of a thoroughgoing connection in reproduction. This objective ground of all association of appearances I call their affinity, and it can be found nowhere except in the principle of the unity of apperception, with respect to all knowledge which is to belong to me. According to this principle, all appearances, without exception, must so enter the mind, or be apprehended, that they agree with the unity of apperception. This would be impossible without synthetic unity or their connection, and so this unity is also objectively necessary. I'm going to read that again, that paragraph. Sorry. Okay. If this unity of association did not also possess an objective ground, which makes it impossible that appearances should be apprehended by the imagination in any other way than under the condition of possible synthetic unity of apprehension, then the fact that appearances form a coherence of human knowledge would be a matter of complete contingency. So, if there wasn't a synthetic unity of apprehension as we understand it that links everything together the way Kant is arguing for, then a coherent human knowledge would be kind of up for grabs, like whether that exists, because like nothing would actually be coming together in a meaningful way. But I mean, how do we know it does? Just because of our experience? I don't know. Maybe that's too much. That's too skeptical. Because every time I wake up, I know everything that's around me. Even though we had the power of associating perceptions, it would still be a matter of uncertainty and contingency whether they would themselves be associable. Okay. Meaning we have a bunch of different perceptions, and they're not, functioning independently. Like, I don't have to remember something every single time I perceive it or something. So they certainly have some sort of associability in my imagination. And, in case they should not be associable, there might exist a number of perceptions, nay, presumably a whole sensibility, in which a great deal of empirical consciousness would be found in my mind. Meaning, if they weren't actually associated, there's a possibility that, like, I have separate and independent perceptions of these different things. Otherwise, and that's the point of the synthetic unity. Okay, so we could have, like, these independent like if it didn't come together in some sort of unity, then we certainly have all these perceptions. Then they would have to be like separate perceptions, like in ourselves, or maybe like a whole different sensibility, as Kant puts it. But that doesn't really make much sense, given like the continuity of our personality and memory and concepts and experience, etc. Okay. but found in separation and without belonging to one consciousness of myself. Okay, that's kind of just the end of that sentence. Sorry, it's a bit of a hanging out there. This, however, is impossible. Only by ascribing all perceptions to one consciousness of original apperception can I say... God damn it. Fuck off, cat. What do you want? Birdie, your water's set up over there. God. Only by ascribing all... Do you want to say something into the mic, Birdie? Very nice. Only by ascribing all perceptions to... What happens is, like, the cat has a fountain. Our cats, we have 2 cats, has a fountain. She doesn't like the fountain sometimes. And then I'll give her a drink from the sink. Just turn my faucet on in my bathroom sink. And then she gets to like that a lot more than the fountain. And then she refuses to drink from the fountain. And so every time she wants to drink, I have to go turn the sink on. It's fun. It's not like I'm depriving her of water right now. She has a ton of water and food. But she just wants me to turn the sink on. I won't do it. Okay, this, however, is impossible. Only by ascribing all perceptions to one consciousness of original apperception, meaning that is conscious of itself, can I say of all perceptions that I am conscious of them. There must, therefore, be an objective ground. This is where he starts to lose me. There must, therefore, be an objective ground, that is, one that can be understood a priori, antecedently, to all empirical laws of the imagination, on which rests the possibility, nay, even the necessity, of a law that pervades all appearances. Right, the law that brings everything into a synthetic unity, I think is what he's saying. A law that makes us look upon all appearances without exception as data of the senses, associable in themselves, and subject to universal rules of a thoroughgoing connection and reproduction. This objective ground of all association of appearances I call their affinity, and it can be found nowhere except in the principle of the unity of apperception with respect to all knowledge which is to belong to me. According to this principle, all appearances, without exception, must so enter the mind or be apprehended that they agree with the unity of apperception. This would be impossible without synthetic unity in their connection. And so this unity is also objectively necessary. Okay, I'm in. Like, I get it. I'm going to go turn the faucet on for the cat. Okay. I just want like an hour to myself every night. Maybe more would be nice, but like I'd take an hour. Just guaranteed hour for the rest of my life, a single hour. No, I want more than that eventually. But anyway. We have thus seen that the objective unity of all empirical consciousness in one... That the objective unity of all, parentheses, empirical, close parentheses, consciousness in one consciousness, that of the original apperception, is the necessary condition even of all possible perception, and the affinity of all appearances, near or remote, is a necessary consequence of a synthesis in imagination which is founded a priori on rules. Imagination is therefore also a power of an a priori synthesis. Imagination is therefore also a power of an a priori synthesis, which is the reason why we call it productive imagination. Okay. And insofar as it aims at nothing but necessary unity in the synthesis of all that is manifold in appearance, this synthesis may be called the transcendental, I've only said it 2 trillion times in the last, 6 months, transcendental function of imagination. However strange, therefore, it may appear at first, it must nevertheless have become clear by this time that the affinity of appearances, and with it their association, and through this association, finally, their reproduction according to laws, and so experience itself, becomes possible only by means of that transcendental function of the imagination. Okay, I think I kind of get it. So, like, in order to experience something, we need the intuition. So we need the sense data, we need the experience of it, and not only do we need that, but if we just had the sense data, we wouldn't be able to make sense of anything. We wouldn't have any actual knowledge. So we take the sense data, and there's the threefold synthesis. I'm not going to get them exactly right, but effectively, we perceive it. We then funnel it through the understanding, and there is a synthesis that goes on. And then after the synthesis, there is a unity that occurs. And that is something that understands and comprehends and holds at all times, like both the sense data experience of that, the resulting synthesized information related to that, and with that we can then in that unity, only then can we actually have knowledge of the thing we experienced. And therefore, the synthesis and the unity are as integral to our experience and understanding and knowledge of the thing, the appearance, because it's not the thing in itself, of the appearance that's presented to us, and making that an actual experience of that thing as an appearance. So that synthesis and shit is just as important as the actual sense data. Whereas, like, traditional empiricists would have just said all that matters is the sense data, and Kant is adding everything else. I think that's kind of like the bottom line-ish here. At least that's my current understanding. For without this transcendental function, no concept of objects could ever come together to form one experience. It is the permanent and unchanging I of pure apperception which forms the correlate of all our representations, insofar as it is at all possible to become conscious of them. And all consciousness belongs quite as much to an all-embracing pure apperception as all sensible intuitions belong as representation to a pure inner intuition, namely to time. It is this apperception which must be added to pure imagination in order to render its function intellectual. For the synthesis of imagination, though carried out a priori, is always in itself sensible, because it combines the manifold only as it appears in intuition. For instance, the shape of a triangle. For the synthesis of imagination, though carried out a priori, is yet always in itself sensible, because it combines the manifold only as it appears in intuition. For instance, the shape of a triangle. But when the manifold is brought into relation with the unity of apperception, right, self-awareness and stuff, being combined with, like, experience and sense data, concepts which belong to the understanding become possible, but only by means of imagination as referred to sensible intuition. We have, therefore, a pure imagination as a fundamental faculty of the human soul. Pure imagination as the fundamental faculty of the human soul, which underlies all knowledge a priori. By means of pure imagination, we bring the manifold of intuition on one side into connection with the coordination of the necessary unity of pure apperception on the other. These two extreme ends namely sensibility and understanding, must necessarily cohere by means of this transcendental function of the imagination, because otherwise sensibility would indeed give us appearances, but would give us no objects of empirical knowledge, and therefore no experience. Okay, I agree. That makes sense. Actual experience, which is made up of apprehension of appearances, their association, reproduction, and lastly their recognition, contains in recognition the last and highest concepts of these merely empirical concepts of experience, which render possible the formal unity of experience and, with it, all objective validity, truth, of empirical knowledge. These grounds of the recognition of the manifold, insofar as they concern only the form of an experience in general, are our categories. Hold on, I gotta start that. Hold on. I gotta turn the water off in the bathroom. The other fun thing is, like, I realized, I turned the water on for the cat the other day and forgot it and left it on all night. Or no, I might have gone to work and left it on all day. Doesn't matter. But I left it on for several hours. And then I came home to, like, a pool of water on the ground. And, like, the sink function is totally fine, just as is. But apparently if there's just constant water running, and this is just, like, a pretty slow drip, apparently it can't handle that. So, yeah. That's also why I'm hesitant to turn it on for her, because I know I'm an idiot and I'll forget to turn it off. Okay, anyway. These grounds of the recognition of the manifold, insofar as they concern only the form of an experience in general, are our categories. Okay. I'm not sure I'm there yet. So, like, all that shit we just talked about, experience, recognition, synthesis, comes out on the other side, apperception of the manifold, like self-awareness. At what point do the categories come in? Like, does it happen before the synthesis or after? It has to happen before the synthesis, right? Because otherwise, like, post-synthesis, like, a lot of stuff is, like, empirical. And he's claiming the categories are, like, a priori, right? The a priori forms of, like, what is given to the synthesis. I think, right? I don't know. On them, the categories, is founded all formal unity in the synthesis of imagination, and by means of this synthesis, all empirical use of the imagination in recognition, reproduction, association, and apprehension, down to the very appearances. It's a lot. For it is only by means of those elements that appearances can belong to knowledge, and to our consciousness in general, and to ourselves. Hence the order and regularity in the appearances, which we call nature, are carried into them by ourselves. Okay, yeah. Hence the order and regularity in the appearances, which we call nature, are carried into them by ourselves. Indeed, we could never find them in nature, if we ourselves, or the nature of our mind, had not originally placed them there. For this unity of nature is meant to be a necessary, that is, an a priori certain unity of the connection of appearances. And how should we have arrived at a priori at such a synthetic unity, if the subjective grounds for such unity were not contained a priori in our minds' original sources of knowledge? And if these subjective conditions were not at the same time objectively valid, by being grounds of the possibility of knowing an object in experience at all? I don't know, Kant. We have already given various explanations of the understanding. By calling it the spontaneity of knowledge, as opposed to the receptivity of sensibility. or the faculty of thought, or the faculty of concepts or of judgments. All of these explanations, when more closely examined, come to the same. We may now characterize the understanding as the faculty of rules. Okay, fascinating. This characterization is more fruitful and approaches nearer to the essence of the understanding. Sensibility gives us forms of intuition, but the understanding gives us rules. The understanding is always busy examining appearances in order to discover some rule in them. Agree? Rules, insofar as they are objective, and therefore necessarily adhere to our knowledge of the object, are called laws. Okay, so rules, insofar as they are objective and actually happen, are called laws. Although experience teaches us many laws, these are only particular determinations of still higher laws, and the highest of them, to which all others are subject, spring a priori from the understanding itself. The highest of the rules. Okay. Hold on. The highest of what? Rules, insofar as they are objective, are called laws. So this is rules of the understanding. The highest rules of the understanding spring a priori from the understanding itself. They are not derived from experience, but on the contrary, they impart to the appearances their lawfulness, and so must make experience possible. The understanding, therefore, is not merely a power for making rules by comparing appearances. The understanding, therefore, is not merely a power for making rules by comparing. It is itself the lawgiver of nature. And without the understanding, there would be no nature at all. That is, no synthetic unity of the manifold of appearances according to rules. Okay. Getting the feels. Like, yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. For appearances, as such, cannot exist outside us, but exist only in our sensibility. This sensibility, I don't know, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like, if you kind of wiped away, I don't know what it might be. But I can like easily imagine a world where, like, if you just presented me with sense data, it would just be nothing. You know, does that make sense? Like, if you somehow were able to, like, take somebody's brain out, but, like, keep their senses, and, like, it would just be, and frankly, I think that's kind of, I don't know. This might not make sense, but kind of what death is. Like, some fidgety, weird sensations that you have, but no recognition, and just constantly grasping towards something that you can't really recognize, but understand as a sensation. I don't know. Anyway, that's not important. But, yeah, this kind of makes a lot of sense to me. This sensibility, as object of knowledge and an experience, with everything it may contain, is possible only in the unity of apperception. But this unity of apperception is the transcendental ground of the necessary lawfulness of all appearances in one experience. The same unity of apperception with reference to a manifold of representations, so as to determine the manifold out of one single representation, forms the rule, and the faculty of these rules is the understanding. Yes. As possible experience, therefore, all appearances lie a priori in the understanding and receive their formal possibility from it. Just as, insofar as they are mere intuitions, they lie in sensibility and are, as far as their form is concerned, only possible through it. However exaggerated and absurd it may sound to say that the understanding is itself the source of the laws of nature, and hence its formal unity, such an assertion is nevertheless correct and in accordance with the object, namely experience. It is quite true, no doubt, that empirical laws, as such, cannot derive their origin from the pure understanding. Empirical laws. Sorry, I was a little confused there. As little as the infinite manifoldness of appearances could be comprehended sufficiently from the pure form of sensible intuition. Right. But all empirical laws are only particular determinations of pure laws of the understanding, under which, and according to the norm of which, the former first become possible, and appearances assume a lawful form, just as much as all appearances, in spite of the variety of their empirical form, must always conform to the conditions of the pure form of sensibility. All right. Hence, pure understanding is, in the categories, he's still losing me on the categories. I'm on board for all of this. I just don't understand. Maybe I need to reread the categories, but hence, pure understanding is, in the categories, the law of the synthetic unity of all appearances, and thus makes experience, as far as its form is concerned, originally and in the first place possible. This, and no more than this, we were called upon to show in the transcendental deduction of the categories, namely, to make comprehensible this relation of the understanding to sensibility, and by means of sensibility to all objects of experience, that is, to make comprehensible the objective validity of the pure a priori concepts of the understanding, and thus to establish their origin in truth. Amen. Okay. This last section of the A deduction is titled Summary Representation of the Correctness and the Sole Possibility of this Deduction of the Pure Concepts of the Understanding. It's a good title. If the objects with which our knowledge has to deal were things in themselves, we could have no a priori concepts of them. Yeah, we kind of established. I think we talked about that a long time ago, like intro, long time ago, maybe preface. For from where should we take them? If we took them from the object, without asking again the question of how this object could become known to us, our concepts would be merely empirical, not a priori. If we took them from within ourselves, then that which is merely in us could not determine the constitution of an object distinct from our representations, that is, could not be a ground as to why there should be a thing to which something like what we have in our thoughts really belongs, and why all this representation should not rather be altogether empty. But if, on the contrary, we have to deal only with appearances, then it is not only possible but necessary that certain a priori concepts should precede our empirical knowledge of objects. As appearances, namely, they form an object that is only within us, because a mere modification of our sensibility can never be found outside us. The very idea that all these appearances, and therefore all objects which we can deal with, are one and all within me, that is, are determinations of my identical self, implies the necessity of a thoroughgoing unity of them in one and the same apperception. This unity of a possible consciousness, however, also makes up the form of all knowledge of objects, whereby the manifold is thought as belonging to one object. The manner, therefore, in which the manifold of sensible representation, intuition, belongs to one consciousness precedes all knowledge of the object as the intellectual form of that knowledge. The manner, therefore, in which the manifold of sensible representation belongs to one consciousness precedes all knowledge of the object. Yes, okay, so unity apperception situation as the intellectual form of that knowledge, and constitutes a formal a priori knowledge of all objects in general, insofar as they are to be thought. Categories. Their synthesis by means of pure imagination, and the unity of all representations with reference to the original apperception, precede all empirical knowledge. Pure concepts of the understanding are therefore a priori possible, and, with regard to experience, are indeed necessary. And this, for the simple reason that our knowledge has to deal with nothing but appearances, the possibility of which lies in ourselves, and the connection and unity of which, in the representation of an object, can be found only in us, as preceding all experience. Nay, as rendering all experience, as far as its form is concerned, possible in the first place. On this ground, the only possible one, our deduction of the categories has been carried out. Whew. Okay. I'm like fascinated to see like what the B deduction is, because like this seems pretty like a pretty good answer to the issue he's dealing with, and pretty complete. And I just have no conception of what Kant thinks he might need to change related to this, or like no expectation of what the B deduction might be. But that's what makes it cool. And it's pretty exciting, to be honest with you. But yeah, I'm trying to watch the Victor Gijsbers videos like in advance of reading all of these sections, and so honestly I'm struggling more with getting through those videos and finding time to do that during the day than I am finding time at night to read just for like 90 minutes or so to finish these, or an hour or whatever it is to finish these sections. But yeah, so I'll try to do part B next, obviously.